We're on.
We're on.
We're on. We're on.
Take number 557.
Yeah. That's what it normally takes when you and I get together, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, so my guest today is Bruce Spizer, the writer of countless books and the expert when it comes to the Beatles on American records, and then he's doing all the other albums as well. So how many books are you up to now, Bruce?
I think I've had 15 published and working on 16 currently, and then I'll do 17 to cap off the Beatles album series, which we can talk about in a minute. But that'll be 17 books, and I look at it this way: someone will say, "Well, it's just 17." You know what I mean? And we'll call it a day.
And of course, the way you looked it is way beyond compare.
Well, I appreciate that.
So we're going to do like sort of an overview of your books, particularly going to be looking at the Beatles coming to America as well. But let's start with the relationship between EMI and Capitol and the frustrations in 63 when George Martin wants the Beatles singles released by Capitol. What was their problem?
Well, Capitol Records was the bulk of the company, purchased by EMI, and I think it was about 1956. And they had a guy named Dave Dexter who they gave the job to review foreign product. And in those days, we were not in a global community by any means. And so what you would have would be that Dexter would release, maybe 20 songs as singles from the UK and sometimes other countries as well, and put them out on Capitol. And for the most part, they did not do very well. Ron Goodwin did about 100,000 units with a song which Capitol changed the title to and called Swinging Sweethearts or something like that. It's an instrumental track. And then kind of out of left field, Laurie London's recording of He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, a little gospel tune by a teenage boy, all of a sudden becomes a number one in the States that maybe was top 10 in the UK. But for the most part, they didn't sell well. Some of them even sold less copies than the promotional records pressed and given away. And so Capitol recorded those as negative sales.
Yeah.
That's pretty bad when you have a song that, sold negative 150 copies. So by and large, it didn't work that well. Cliff Richard, big hit in the UK. He'd sell a couple of hundred units, maybe 1,000 if you were lucky. Helen Shapiro, one of her singles got up to 20,000, but most of them were, really low figures. And so by the time you were getting to the 60s, Dexter was frustrated. It was like, well, why am I putting out 20 of these if we're only selling, hundreds of copies? So he would put out maybe a half a dozen British singles in the States. So in late 1962, he gets this little song called Love Me Do by this group, the Beatles. And Dexter's background, you have to understand, was in jazz and rhythm and blues, and he wasn't a rock and roll person. And he listens to Love Me Do, and it has this harmonica in it, but it's a pop or a rock song, and harmonica's a blues instrument and has no business being on that record, and so I ain't going to put that out. And he also, around that time, gets a record from a guy named Frank Ifield called I Remember You, and it's got harmonica and yodeling. He certainly ain't going to put that out. That ain't suitable for the American market. And so EMI is not terribly concerned about the Beatles because, quite frankly, nobody wanted to put the Beatles out to begin with. They're from Liverpool. They have a strange name, and, who cares about them? But Frank Ifield, he's had some number one hits. We got to do something about that. And so there's an attorney in the States, a guy named Paul Marshall, and he represents a company called Transglobal Music, Inc., which is EMI doing business in the States. And the main purpose of Transglobal is that they're leasing things like, blues records and other things from the States to put out on EMI labels throughout the world, including the UK. And one of the companies they work with is Vee-Jay Records, has some blues artists, John Lee Hooker, people like that, Jimmy Reed. And so this guy, Paul Marshall, ends up also representing Vee-Jay at times. And he gets the idea, I'm representing both these people, so we'll go ahead and get Vee-Jay to put out Frank Ifield's I Remember You and see what happens. Well, it's at the same time that Vee-Jay is releasing a song called Sherry by the Four Seasons. So VeeJay is this black gospel R&B label out of Chicago, black owned, small label. And all of a sudden, they've got this white group, the Four Seasons, that sound like they're black. So that becomes a #1 hit. And Frank Ifield's Remember You certainly doesn't sound black, but it crosses over and it's a #5 hit. So store that away for a couple of months in your back of the mind, as we move forward in time. So now George Martin records the Beatles' second single, Please Please Me. And by this time, he believes in the group. Fellows, you've just recorded your first #1. And he's certain that the mighty Capitol Records will release it in the States, and the Beatles can do something no British act has ever done, and that is have, longevity of hits in the United States. And Dave Dexter listens to Please Please Me. And what does Please Please Me open up with? Harmonica. Yeah. So he doesn't want to put that out. And so once again, Paul Marshall is, okay, let's see if we can get this placed somewhere. And none of the majors are interested in it, Columbia, Atlantic, nobody. And so, maybe VeeJay will put it out after all. They did well with Frank Ifield. So VeeJay puts out Please Please Me, and it comes out around, let's say, mid-February-ish. February 7 is its official release date, and we believe it may have been played as early as February 14th on WLS in Chicago. Why? Because Chicago is where VeeJay is. Yeah. And VeeJay's president, Ewart Abner, hustles those records to those DJs. And as Dick Biondi said, and he was the first person to play the Beatles as best we can determine in America, Ewart had the best booze and the best girls, and we'll leave it at that. So Please Please Me gets on gets top 40 in Chicago, but it also gets airplay in other markets, unlike the UK, where you had the BBC and needle restrictions and all kind of other crazy things. In the States, it was the wild, wild west. You could play as many records as you wanted. And most cities have multiple radio stations. And they played what they wanted. It wasn't like there was some clear channel programming for the entire country. It was great fun, great fun. And so in certain places, like in California, and then also Miami and Houston and other markets, Please Please Me got a little bit of airplay. But alas, it only sold about 5,000 copies in the entire United States. Not very good. So the next Beatles single is going to come out, a little tune called From Me to You. And that one, I think, probably topped the charts in the UK more than any other British single, if I'm not mistaken. So From Me to You is going to come out on the VeeJay label. And it has a couple of things working against it. The biggest one is a guy named Del Shannon. Del Shannon is on the bill with the Beatles at the Royal Albert Hall, and he hears the Beatles do this new song, From Me to You. And he tells John, I'm going to do you guys a favor. I'm going to record that song. And John, I think, initially was very flattered by it, although then he realized, that might not be good. So let's go back in time. You're a disc jockey in the United States, and you're looking at a label of this record, and it's From Me to You by the Beatles, and it's written by McCartney, Lennon, and you don't know who they are. And then that same song is by Del Shannon, putting it out, written by those McCartney, Lennon, whoever they are. And Del Shannon had a runaway hit a few years earlier. So which one are you going to go with? So From Me to You gets more airplay by Del Shannon than the Beatles. And so it doesn't do all that great. But in August, it actually does start to get more airplay out in California. And it ends up selling about 20,000 units, which is better, but not that great. Well, to give you an idea of how out of touch our good buddy Dave Dexter is, Capitol Records is located in Hollywood, California, right next to LA. Dexter's offices are in the Capitol Tower. And if Dave Dexter had been listening to the radio, KRLA, LA, yeah, top 40 radio station in LA, is playing a song called From Me to You by the Beatles. And it is a top 40 song. At the time, Dave Dexter has got to decide what to do about the Beatles. Now, he didn't turn down From Me to You in spite of everybody saying he did. He didn't have the opportunity to do so because remember when I told you VeeJay leased and put out Please Please Me? There was a rider to that contract that gave them a right of first refusal for the length of the contract, which was 5 years. So therefore, From Me to You is put out by VeeJay. Capitol couldn't have turned it down. It wasn't offered to them. So our good buddy Ewart Abner, who had the best booze and the best girls, also had a gambling problem. And as president of VeeJay, he owed the boys in Vegas some money. They probably told him, you can either pay off your debts or lose your legs. Like most people, he probably liked walking. So he paid off his gambling debts by embezzling money from Vee-Jay. Vee-Jay did not have the money to pay royalties on those big Frank Ifield selling records or the Beatles records. And so they owed about maybe 700, not a lot of money to EMI on these royalties, but because they didn't pay the royalties and the company was facing bankruptcy because they didn't have any money because he would have taken the money, Vee-Jay wasn't putting out any records. Things looked bleak, and Paul Marshall, who represented Vee-Jay and EMI, knew this. And so EMI basically unilaterally terminated its license agreement with Vee-Jay. Now, as a lawyer, I can tell you that Vee-Jay would have had some really good defenses, because at the time EMI said, Vee-Jay, you owe us about 7,000 royalties. EMI owed Vee-Jay about 20,000 in royalties. So, yeah, too bad I wasn't a lawyer for Vee-Jay. The world would be a different place. But anyway, I digress. So, because Ifield and the Beatles are no longer for Vee-Jay, Dave Dexter has the opportunity to put both of those records out. So in August, well, for me to you, Unknown to Dexter is a top 40 hit. He listens to I'm Confessing by Frank Ifield and She Loves You by the Beatles, and determines one of these songs is suitable for the American market and the other just, we ain't putting it out. And so, of course, to celebrate the thing, he takes out a full-page ad in Billboard magazine for the next big thing, I'm Confessing by Frank Ifield, and passes on She Loves You. Now, ironically, what instrument is in I'm Confessing that is not in She Loves You? Harmonica. Yeah, very strange. So, Dexter didn't get rock and roll, and he certainly didn't like the Beatles. So he passes on that. Maybe he had an in for the producer, George Martin, because George Martin wrote him a letter and wanted him to put out a song called Cool Ghoul, which was a Halloween type song. And Capitol did put it out and didn't sell very well. So maybe he didn't have a lot of respect.
Maybe he just remembered the name.
Yeah, could be. That George Martin bloke writing me a letter, and I don't want to put,
How dare he?
So what happens with She Loves You? Well, there's a label called Swan Records, smaller than Vee-Jay, but they had a little bit of success. They had a song called Palisades Park by Freddie Cannon. That was actually the first single on a label called, in the UK, Stateside Records, which EMI had put out records from the United States. And so the owner of Swan Records, Bernie Bennett was one of them, he certainly knew the EMI people. And he also sometimes went to London, and he had heard of the Beatles. So when he had the opportunity to put out She Loves You, he jumped at it. And this time, though, EMI was not quite so generous with the terms of the licensing agreement. Rather than a 5-year deal, it was a 2-year deal, and it was exclusively for single release only, which can come into play. Also, in case Swan did well with the record and sold 50,000 copies of the record, then they would have the next Beatles single. So all these things are out there. Now, She Loves You is put out by Vee-Jay, and, Swan is in Philadelphia, PA, home of American Bandstand and Dick Clark. But anyway, Dick Clark, to help his buddies out at Swan, because he used to have an ownership interest in Swan until he was forced to get rid of it. So he goes ahead and puts it on TV. And they had a segment called Radar Record. And in Radar Record, it scored in the low 70s, which was not a good score. And when they showed a picture of the Beatles, the kids laughed at the long hair and all. And I guess they didn't think She Loves You, didn't have a beat, couldn't dance to it. I don't know what they were thinking. So anyway, Swan does put it out, but it sells extremely poor. I mean, in the hundreds. Wow. Total bomb. Now we're kind of moving forward. And Capitol Records, once again, Dave Dexter has sent a copy of the new Beatles single, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And of course, Dexter turns it down. Yeah. Now, Brian is a very frustrated individual at this point. Yeah. And so he gets on the phone and he does what anybody should do if they're frustrated with the company. Go to the top. And he calls the president of Capitol, Alan Livingston, and says, Mr. Livingston, I'm the Beatles manager, and why won't you release our records on your label? And he says, well, quite frankly, I've never heard them. You know, we have this guy, Dave Dexter, who does that type of stuff. And Brian says, well, would you give it a listen? And he says, okay, fair enough. So he says, you know, he hits the intercom at the Capitol Tower and says, Dex, bring me up a copy of those Beatle records. And Dexter says, Alan, forget them. They're nothing. They're a bunch of long-haired kids. And Livingston says, just the same, I want to hear it. So he listens to I Want to Hold Your Hand and thinks there's something there and decides they're going to put it out. So he calls Brian back and says, well, we'll put out your new single. And Brian, running a bluff because he couldn't stop Capitol if he wanted to, says, well, not so fast, we're not going to let you put out that record unless you agree to spend about $40,000 promoting it. And for whatever reason, Livingston says, okay. Wow. And in those days, how did record companies promote? Well, in the U.S., you took out ads in Billboard magazine, in Cashbox, and maybe Music Vendor, which later would become Record World. Your thinking was by doing this, you were reaching distributors who would know about the record to have in their distributions, record stores who you would want to carry the records so people could buy them, and radio stations who also read these trade magazines so that they would play the songs. And you had done your work.
Yeah.
Nobody really marketed to the consumer, the person who bought the actual records.
Well, that's a bit radical, isn't it?
It was at the time, really. This is the brilliance. When I was in graduate business school at Tulane, I concentrated in finance and marketing, and I was fascinated by the marketing. I kept looking for examples of direct marketing by record companies, and they were few and far between.
Wow.
So what happens is, ads in Billboard aren't that expensive. And, and what is $40,000 in today's dollars? $400,000. That's a lot of money.
Big budget.
So, yeah. So, what, £500,000 or something. So what Capitol does is they come up with a marketing plan. First of all, the Beatles are British. So the British are coming, that revolutionary war cry. The Beatles are coming. And how do you describe Beatles music? You don't. So, but what do they have? Radically long hair. So Capitol showed, this radically long hair, and that was in the message, the Beatles are coming. They also, so they had these stickers made up, and they told their employees, get these stickers to your friends and kids and have them plaster these stickers all over the place. They also went ahead and put out a tabloid newspaper, about 8 pages long, called the National Record News. The funny thing about the National Record News was every article in it was about the Beatles, and it was published, of course, by Capitol Records.
Yeah.
And these were distributed in record stores, but not only that, they gave them to kids and said, get these in your high school, distribute them at school. And so there was this groundswell of interest in the Beatles that was starting to build up in late December. Capitol also was going to put out I Want to Hold Your Hand in mid-January, and that was the plan. It was a good plan because they didn't sign the Beatles until late November, early December, and you would never release new product that late in the Christmas season. Wouldn't do it. Never done. So a couple of strange things start happening. One of them, just to show you the brilliance of the Beatles, and then we'll get back on track because I think it's a fun little story. In Worcester, Massachusetts, which is in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, there's a station there called WORC, and they play records that people request to hear. And they even put out a separate survey that's based strictly on requests, not record sales. Yeah. And they have a disc jockey there, Dick the Derby Smith. And Dick the Derby Smith, has this little single on the Swan label, which is She Loves You and I'll Get You. And this is kind of interesting. So he begins playing She Loves You in late November of 1963 before Beatlemania's hit. And by mid-December, guess what's number 10 on the charts on WORC? She Loves You. Isn't that incredible? Well before Beatlemania. Doesn't stop there, though. Guess what's number 1? No, not Dominique by the Singing Nun, not Bobby Vinton, not this, not even Louie Louie. Number 1 is I'll Get You by the Beatles. The most requested song that week in Worcester, Massachusetts, is a B-side of a single of a band nobody's ever heard of in the States.
That's incredible.
That's how great the music is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we get back on track now. And so Capitol's plan is to put it out. Well, there were a few things that happened in the States that may not seem all that significant, but they kind of are. On November 15th, the three major U.S. television networks, and there were really only three back in those days, not counting public television, and they were NBC, CBS, and ABC. And while the Beatles were playing at Bournemouth, England, the London bureaus of all three networks filmed the Beatles. ABC apparently doesn't do anything with that footage. NBC airs it shortly thereafter on the Huntley Brinkley Report.
Yeah.
And CBS is going to air it on a Friday in November. And on Friday morning, it airs on the CBS Morning News with Mike Wallace. But nobody, including Mike Wallace, remembers airing that story because the Friday we're speaking of is November 22nd.
Yeah.
And shortly after that story airs, President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. And so for that reason, the evening news that night, which normally would run a feature from the morning news, doesn't run the feature because the news is dominated by the Kennedy assassination. So a couple of weeks later, Walter Cronkite is thinking, it's been a really rough couple of weeks. He's the anchor. He's also the news director for the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
And he says, okay, we got the Cold War. We've got civil rights unrest. President's been assassinated. Why don't we run that little story on the Beatles on the evening news? And so on December 10th, at the very end of the broadcast, the CBS Evening News shows this 4-minute story on the Beatles.
Yeah. Those are the Beatles, those are. And this is Beatleland, formerly known as Britain, where an epidemic called Beatlemania has seized the teenage population, especially female. Some of the girls can write, and they belong to the Beatle fan club. The Beatles sound like insect life, but it's spelled B-E-A-T, beat. And these four boys from Liverpool with their dish mop hairstyles are Britain's latest musical and, in fact, sociological phenomenon. They have introduced what their press agents call the Mersey sound, after the River Mersey on which Liverpool stands. And though musicologists say it is no different than any other rock and roll, except maybe louder, it has carried the Beatles to the top of the heap. In fact, they have met royalty, and royalty is appreciative and impressed. Wherever the Beatles go, they are pursued by hordes of screaming, swinging juveniles. They and their press agents have to think up all sorts of ways to evade their adoring fans. Thousands of teenagers in every city and town stand in line all night to get tickets for their touring show. Girls faint when the tickets run out. The other night, the Beatles played Bournemouth, the South Coast family resort, and Bournemouth will never be the same. Reporter Josh Darsa talked to the Beatles in their dressing room.
What has occurred to you as to why you've succeeded?
I don't know, really. You know, as you say, the haircuts. We didn't think they were a gimmick, but everyone else said, oh, what a gimmick.
What is the Mersey sound? How does it differ from other rock and roll and pop?
It doesn't really. It just happened that all of a sudden hundreds of rock groups, all from Liverpool, made records, and it was a bit more like the original rock and roll than the stuff they've had over the last few months. So people decided suddenly, you know, there's all these Liverpool groups, so they call it the Liverpool sound and the Mersey beat and everything else.
On the Nicky Cuff all thing.
Yeah, but it's just, yeah.
It's just a way of classifying it, but I don't think the music's very different.
Do you have any fears that your public eventually will get tired of you and move on to a new favorite?
Well, they probably will, but, you know,
You ever think about
depends how long it takes for them to get tired.
Yeah.
Don't it?
It's stupid to worry about things like that because I mean it could.
It's not worth
could happen.
missing your sleep for, is it?
No, by
Boring.
God it isn't.
No.
It could
What do you
happen
think,
tomorrow, and it could, we could have quite a run.
This is.
We just hope we are going to have quite a run.
The Beatles, who started their act in the waterfront pubs of Liverpool, are now clicking off $5,000 a week in one-night stands. They have sold 2.5 million records. They lead the hit parade. They get the biggest fan mail on record. They have inspired the sheepdog hairdo. They are also credited with having saved the sagging British corduroy industry. And besides being merely the latest objects of adolescent adulation and culturally the modern manifestation of compulsive tribal singing and dancing, the Beatles are said by sociologists to have a deeper meaning. Some say they are the authentic voice of the proletariat. Some say they are the authentic heart of Britain in revolt against the American cult of pop singers represented by Elvis Presley and the long line of his British imitators. Some say the Beatles represent authentic British youth, or British youth as it would like to be, self-confident, natural, direct, decent, vital, throbbing. The Beatles themselves seem to have no illusions. They symbolize the 20th century non-hero as they make non-music, wear non-haircuts, give non-mercy. And meanwhile, the fan mail keeps rolling in, and so does the money. This is Alexander Kendrick in Beatleland.
And afterwards, Walter Cronkite gets a call immediately from a guy named Ed Sullivan.
Yeah.
Ed Sullivan is excited because a month earlier, when Brian Epstein was in the States, he met with Brian and he agreed to run the Beatles on 3 of his programs, a group unknown in America, taking a super big risk. And now they're on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And Walter picks up the phone and Sullivan's like, Walter, what can you tell me about those bugs or whatever they call themselves? Because he's so excited about it. And also, something else interesting happens. Normally, the Ed Sullivan Show wouldn't plug that far in advance. But almost immediately after that broadcast, we're going to have the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. Okay, that's kind of cool. And also there's this 15-year-old girl in Silver Spring, Maryland, who saw the CBS Evening News with her parents. Her name is Marsha Albert. And she sends an email. No, she didn't send an email. They didn't have email back then. She did what Chuck Berry said. She wrote a letter to her local DJ, a guy named Carol James at WWDC. And she said, I saw this group, the Beatles, on the CBS Evening News. Why can't we have music like that in America? And Carol James had also seen the story, and he also knew what we called stewardesses in those days. Now they're called flight attendants. Don't make that mistake, or you won't get the free peanuts. So anyway, what happens is that he contacts this stewardess friend of his who flies for BOAC, as in flew in from Miami Beach, British Overseas Airways Corporation. And so what happens is she says, look, I'll bring you the latest Beatles 45, which happens to be I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Yeah.
So on this, which is going to be coming out in mid-January. So on the evening of December 17th, 1963, Carol James invites 15-year-old Marsha Albert down to the station to introduce the record. And very nervous, very cute, she introduces the song, and it gets played. And afterwards, Carol James says, well, listeners, write and let us know what you think. Nobody wastes time to write. The switchboard lights up like a Christmas tree. And the next thing you know, they're playing the song in heavy rotation, the British copy of the single. Apparently, Carol James makes a dub of it and sends it to some DJ buddies of his in St. Louis and Chicago. But the key thing is Capitol is finding out that this record is getting airplay. So what do? They have their attorney, Walter Hofer, call up WWDC and say, quit playing the record. It's not coming out till mid-January. Carol James says, are you nuts? This is a hit record. And they think, maybe we should rethink this. And so they tell their employees, we're going to rush this record out and basically forget about your Christmas season if you're working at the pressing plant. And oh, by the way, we're going to be talking to people at RCA and Decca's pressing plants because we need to get as many copies possible. They also talk to their normal printer and tell them we need copies of a picture sleeve. And the normal printer says, hey, it's Christmas Eve, forget it. Well, basically, it's too late. Well, there's a little company up there called Queen's Litho, and they agree, yeah, we'll get it out. And they get the Beatles business because they do this. And they, and because they help Capitol out, many of these, in fact, all of the East Coast Capitol picture sleeves are printed by this little company, Queen's Litho, because they bust their butt to make sure that record will have picture sleeves when it comes out.
Yeah.
It comes out the day after Christmas. Now, let's think about this. The day after Christmas, the kids are playing video games. No, they don't have video games. What are they doing? They're listening to the radio. And WMCA begins playing I Want to Hold Your Hand. And WINS and WABC, the other top 40 stations, soon follow suit. And all of a sudden, kids are hearing this Beatles song in saturation airplay. They also have Christmas and Hanukkah money, and mommy and daddy can take them to the record store. And within a week or so, I Want to Hold Your Hand is #1 in New York. And the rest of the nation soon follows suit. So this is really significant because by the time the Beatles are on the Ed Sullivan Show, Sullivan had booked them for February 9 and February 16, and he taped another thing that he might show later on if the Beatles, pay off. So in the normal course of events, I Want to Hold Your Hand would begin to get airplay in mid-January.
Yeah.
And by the time they're on the Sullivan Show, the Beatles might have a top 10 hit. But that isn't what happens here. The record comes out, it runs up the charts right away. VeeJay re-releases Please Please Me and puts From Me to You on the B-side just in case. And Swan re-releases She Loves You. And all of a sudden, you've got these 3 great songs in saturation radio airplay. Pretty cool. In addition to that, Vee-Jay releases their Introducing the Beatles album, which they were going to put out in the summer '63, but did not. Why? They didn't have any money.
Yeah.
So that album comes out, and Capitol Rush releases its Meet the Beatles album, which was going to come out in mid-February, and then was going to come out December 17th. I mean, not December 17th, January 17th. But Alan Livingston tells them around December 10, hey, if we got it, let's get it in the stores as quick as we can. And so around the same time, Vee-Jay, maybe a day or so sooner, both of these albums hit the stores. Both companies are hoping for sales of 250,000 units. Vee-Jay ultimately sells about 1.4 million, and Capitol has sold 3.6 million copies of that within a couple of months, shattering expectations, to put it mildly. No teen album in the States had ever sold more than 250,000 units. The Beach Boys, the Four Seasons, 250,000, absolute top you could sell.
Amazing.
So when the Beatles were on the Sullivan Show, many people say, oh, that's when Beatlemania started in America. No way. Beatlemania had been building for weeks.
Yeah.
Now, they're on the Sullivan Show and 73 million people tune in. Normally it's 20 to 30 million. So that right there is proof that Beatlemania was already there.
Yeah.
Well, what was the significance of the Sullivan Show? It was the first time most Americans got to see the Beatles perform live. You saw film of them on the Jack Parr Show in early January, but not as big an audience.
No.
Not many people, there were little images of them on the news, but this was 5 full songs by the Beatles performed in front of a very enthusiastic, screaming audience. And that made a big deal. So I always view it as the Sullivan Show is the explanation point on the word Beatlemania. It's kind of the way I view it. A really big deal. And of course, the Beatles were on the Sullivan Show the following week from Miami Beach. Oddly enough, technically Mitzi Gaynor was the headliner on that show, but people, of course, tuned in to see the Beatles.
Yeah.
The audience was a little more staid because it was, a Miami audience at a hotel. And, there were a lot of more elderly people there that were going there to just see the novelty of it all. And of course, everyone knew there was no way you could draw 73 million people again. And the critics were right. They only drew 72 million for that show. Anyway, so that was a pretty crazy story of how it all happened. And I know I'm doing a lot of talking. Do you have any questions or anything?
No, I mean, that's what I wanted you to do, the talking.
All right.
What sort of jumps out is this phone call between Brian and Alan Livingstone.
Yeah.
Changes everything. So if you only could, what was it that convinced Livingston that this was the, because like you were saying, that's a big budget to suddenly say, against what Dave Dexter's saying, actually, I'm going to put a lot of money into this.
Yeah, I think part of it was he truly liked what he was hearing. And also he had been hearing what they were doing in England and thought, if we can do a little bit of what they're doing in England, and what better way to do it? Big publicity campaign, because British records normally don't sell. So maybe that's not a bad idea to throw all this money at it. Let's do it and see what happens. And he said he has no idea if they spent 40,000 or 30,000 or 50,000. He said, we just did whatever we needed to do. I mean, and it worked extremely well.
Yeah.
You know, the Beatles arrived at the airport and there are 3,000 kids cutting school on a Friday to greet them on a cold, cold February day.
Yeah.
And, and it's just an incredible thing that you just really couldn't duplicate if you tried, I mean,